Who was Burnham? Part 2. Today we continue the series of podcasts focusing on the life and career of Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham, that famous Guyanese and Caribbean political icon. In our previous episode, entitled, Who was Forbes Burnham?, we learned that he had been educated in England and had decided to return to his home country, British Guiana. Hi there, and welcome once again to the Aaron Darcy Project, where we look back at some of the people and events that have shaped the history of Guyana and countries of the Caribbean. Today, we continue to look at the life of one of the greatest minds to emerge from Guyana in the 20th century. I am your host, Aaron Darcy. Thanks for joining us. Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham returned to British Guiana from his studies in the United Kingdom in 1949 and joined one of the large private law chambers in the city, but he was very ambitious and quickly moved along. He soon established his own practice and that same year, became leader of the British Guiana Labour Party, BGLP, which had been formed in 1946. In the 1947 elections, his Labour Party won 5 of 14 seats in the Legislative Council, making him the party with the most seats. Within a year of being back in his country, Burnham co-founded the People's Progressive Party, PPP, on January 1, 1950, along with Chethy Jagan, another very powerful political figure. Chethy Jagan was chosen to be the leader of the newly formed PPP, his wife Janet Jagan became the secretary, and Burnham the first party chairman. Jagan had led the Political Affairs Committee, which now merged with Burnham's Labour Party to form the PPP. Burnham chose the name of the new party. In 1952, Forbes Burnham became the president of the party's affiliated trade union, the British Guiana Labour Union. He was subsequently elected to the Georgetown City Council in 1953. General elections in British Guiana were held on April 27, 1953, and the PPP won 18 of 24 seats, with both Burnham and his sister Jessie elected to the House of Assembly. In his quest for power even then, Burnham threatened to split the party if he were not made sole leader of the PPP. However, a compromise was reached by which Burnham and his allies in the party received ministerial appointments. In the short-lived PPP government that followed, Burnham served as Minister of Education. But this was to eventually lead to a parting of ways as time unfolded. Newly formed government was united in their dissent against colonial rule, and refused to send a delegation to the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, which took place on the 2nd of June 1953 at Westminster Abbey in London. The PPP began demanding self-government and repealed several laws which the Colonial Office wanted to keep in place. This act of defiance, however, was being played out at a time when Western powers were fighting against a growing fear of world communism, and so this defiance was viewed as being part of that. British statesmen and American politicians were worried about a possible communist revolution in British Guiana. Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, remarked that, quote, "We ought surely to get American support in doing all we can to break the communist teeth in British Guiana," unquote. This is recorded in the pages of the Encyclopaedia Britannica. This fear of communist influence in the colony caused the British government to suspend the constitution on October 9, 1953. A state of emergency was declared, and a large military force was brought in to occupy the country. Under the direction of the British Colonial Office, the governor assumed direct rule of the colony under an interim government, and this continued until 1957. The two local political leaders, Burnham and Jagan, then went to London to protest the occupation, but they were met with utter disdain and their effort proved unsuccessful. While in London, they were subject to secret surveillance by British intelligence services. Leaving England, Burnham and Jagan travelled to India in an attempt to find support for their cause against the British, but this too turned out to be a complete waste of time. Upon returning to their country, which was still under the suspension of the constitution, the interim government very strangely imposed fewer restrictions on Burnham than on the other senior members of his party, the PPP. While some senior party members were locked up and put in prison, Burnham was not. As time went by, he was given tacit encouragement to create a breakaway faction within his party. Burnham would do this 2 years later. At a conference held at the Metropole Cinema in Georgetown on February 12 to 13, 1955, the People's Progressive Party, PPP, was split into two factions, one led by Burnham and the other by Jagan. Jagan espoused a socialist domestic agenda, but Burnham's faction declared a more moderate one. On the 12th of August 1957, elections were once again held, and the Jagan's faction of the PPP won 9 of 14 elective seats in a new legislature, and Burnham's just 3. Shortly after the 1957 elections, Forbes Burnham went on to form the People's National Congress, PNC, and became leader of the opposition. Also in 1957, Burnham was elected president of the Guyana Bar Association, a position he held until 1964. The political split further deepened the racial division between the blacks and the Indians in British Guiana. Local politics continued to follow mainly along racial lines, with PPP support coming from those of South Asian background and PNC support from those of African descent. This divide also followed the rural-urban split, with PNC supporters tending to live in urban coastal areas and those of the PPP in rural interior areas. After the split, Jagan's PPP and Burnham's PNC became the political expressions of the Indians and those of African descent respectively, with each party advocating for their supporters' interests. The PNC entered its first election under that name in 1961 when general elections were held, and Burnham's PNC party won 11 seats in the Legislative Assembly with 41% of the popular vote. Despite winning just 1.64% more of the vote than the PNC, the PPP won 20 seats, nearly double the number of seats won by the PNC. The PPP was then allowed to form a government. This resulted in mass demonstrations, racial tensions, and a general strike. The governor declared a state of emergency and British troops were once again deployed in British Guiana to bring some amount of order in the country. On January 31, 1962, the PPP government announced what would later be known as the Kaldor budget, advised by economist Nicholas Kaldor, which included an increase in tax and import duty. Opposition parties, including the PNC, opposed the budget and once again organized mass demonstrations. According to the Wynne-Parry Commission, which afterwards investigated this uprising, Burnham gave a speech urging action against the budget on February 12, 1962. This mass action culminated on February 16, 1962, during which 56 businesses were destroyed, 87 damaged by fire, and 66 looted. Nearly all of the businesses were owned by Indian Guyanese. A police superintendent was killed and 39 officers injured. Some rioters were fatally shot and 41 others injured. Mobs of opposition supporters attacked schools, the electricity plant, the water supply plant, the buildings of Parliament and the residence of the PPP leader, Chedi Jagan. British troops were brought in and quickly took control of the situation. One British soldier would later recall that, quote, "Smoke covered the city of Georgetown and large fires were everywhere," end quote. This day would go down in history as Black Friday. This pattern of violence and destruction of property was established as a political tool since then, and even after that country became independent, this political tool continued to be used by those who sought to hold on to power. But as history would later reveal, there was a story behind the events that led up to this Black Friday. According to subsequently declassified documents, the Western governments became increasingly convinced in the early 1960s that Jagan's PPP government had communist ideals. Jagan's radical views and alliances with the Soviet Union and Cuba helped to further promote this concern. Forbes Burnham, on the other hand, was aligned with and supported by Western nations. In May 1962, certain government officials in the US held direct talks with their British counterparts, and as a result, Burnham was invited to visit Washington. Senior American officials decided that Burnham's proposed socialism was preferable to Jagan's ideology, and so in 1962, intervention against Jagan's government was approved. Independence for British Guiana was delayed, allowing time for a covert operation to be put in place by Western intelligence agencies. Both Peter de Geer, leader of the third largest party, the United Force, and Burnham, pledged their support for this and began to receive financial aid from these agencies. The CIA has been accused of assisting strike action against the PPP government beginning in 1963, which eventually turned to violence, with arson and bombing at government buildings. Burnham was mentioned in police reports. In 1963, after further talks between the Americans and the British, a decision was reached to impose a December 1964 election, using proportional representation. This was the only condition under which British Guiana would be granted independence. The Americans received assurances from Burnham and de Geer that their two parties would support each other in the election, and U.S. money would be used for political campaigning. In the months leading up to the December 1964 elections, widespread violence was once again carried out by supporters of the main opposition party. The violence resulted in nearly 200 murders and 2,600 families being displaced. Nearly all of the victims were PPP supporters. A series of racially motivated attacks took place in and around Mackenzie, a bauxite mining community in the upper Demerara River, an area that included the town of Wismar. Among the more bloody of these incidents was the Wismar massacre on May 26, the sinking of the Sun Chapman, a small ferryboat used by locals on July 6, and the subsequent murders of 5 more Indian individuals. Later that year in August 1964, the leaders of the 3 main political parties Jagan, Burnham and de Geer met to discuss reducing the spate of violence. As this meeting was taking place, the headquarters of the PPP was bombed by the opposition party's agents. More violence continued throughout 1964. In the December 7, 1964 election, Jagan's PPP won the highest percentage of the vote, 46% to the PNC's 41%, but it did not secure a majority. Forbes Burnham successfully formed a coalition with the United Force, TUF, which had won the remaining 12% of the votes, and he became Premier of British Guiana on December 14. Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham would remain as head of government for the next 21 years, through a series of political maneuvering, skullduggery and downright use of violence that kept opposition forces at bay and made him a force to be reckoned with. He would be remembered as a political giant in the annals of Guyanese and Caribbean history. Join us in the next episode of the Aaron Darcy Project, when we will continue to explore the pages of history and discover who was Forbes Burnham. There is so much to learn about one of the great personalities of Guyana and the Caribbean. Thanks for joining us and for supporting this channel. If you continue to find our material interesting and entertaining, please like, share and subscribe to our channel. Goodbye for now.